So Rebecca Fortescue has a background in general practice and is coordinating editor of the Cochrane's Airway Group. She's heavily involved with Cochrane through author training and also teaches students about evidence-based practice. She's also been involved in the production of national and international guidelines on asthma and bronchiectasis, and she's due to talk to us today about what makes a good systematic review. So welcome, Rebecca, if you're happy to turn your screen on and your mic.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Becky. It's a real privilege to have been invited to speak at this event and to hopefully share with you all a little bit of my enthusiasm for systematic review. Not something I ever thought I would say. I got involved with Cochrane slightly accidentally as an ST4 when I was training to be a GP. It happened to be a sort of a project I could do during a sort of part-time academic placement I was doing, and I just found I really enjoyed it. It was a lovely team to work with, Cochrane Airways at St George's in London, and I've sort of been hanging around there ever since. So yes, hopefully I will give you a bit of an introduction today to what might make a good systematic review, and just give you a few things to sort of think about as sort of an intro. Lots of the things I say will be sort of mentioned only fairly briefly, but will no doubt be sort of come back to in later talks and in next week's seminar. If you have any questions as I'm going along, then please don't hesitate to sort of put a hand up or to ask, especially if something isn't clear. And do also let me know if there's any problems hearing me or seeing me. And obviously there is a session, a sort of 15-minute session at the end as well for any further questions that you might have thought of. So I will move on to my first slide. There we go. So first of all, I'm sure many of you will be quite familiar with systematic reviews already, and judging by the number of you who already access Cochrane resources, it sounds like many of you are using systematic reviews quite frequently. But in a nutshell, they aim to identify, assess, synthesize, and apply the results of primary research that's addressing a defined question. So that's sort of what we define them as. So why might you use one? What's the point and why do we do them? Well, they're quite a lot of work to produce. Why bother? Isn't it better just to read the original research? Well, in an ideal world, we might have time to critically appraise all the primary research addressing a particular question. But in reality, sort of busy practice, we're really unlikely to be able to do that. So take an example here, something I'm quite familiar with my background in general practice, but you might be weighing up the evidence for giving antibiotics to a child with otitis media. If you search the Cochrane Central Register of Controlled Trials using the words otitis media, child, and antibiotics, you get nearly 500 hits. I did this a few days ago and found that. So if you wanted to skim the title and abstract of each of these controlled clinical trials, many of them will be RCTs, it would take about 30 seconds maybe to decide whether it's relevant to you or not if you just looked at the title and the abstract. But that's going to take you over 4 hours before you've worked out how many, if any, of these are actually relevant to your question. However, if you put the filter on your search to look for only systematic reviews, you find that the third hit there, which I've highlighted with the red arrow, looks quite relevant and will hopefully present the evidence you're looking for in a more digestible way. And the advantage here is that the author team will have already done all the searching, they've already done all the sifting through those hundreds of studies, they'll have done some critical appraisal, looking at each of the studies, and then combined the results in a way that hopefully is more accessible, and then will have also interpreted those results for you. Another advantage that we know, primary research can be very expensive and very time consuming. Sometimes studies are just not big enough to reach a firm conclusion. But a good systematic review may have a better chance of identifying harms or benefits of treatment because it combines data from multiple different studies. So that's another advantage of a sort of an evidence synthesis that you might have. So, oops. Moving on. So what makes a good systematic review? I mean, like any piece of research, there are likely to be some good examples out there and some not so good examples out there. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a very rapid increase in the number of systematic reviews published. And while they're often placed at the top of the evidence hierarchy, they do have the potential to be misleading if they've not been performed correctly or following appropriate methods. And I put a few ideas here of things that are often thought to be markers of a good systematic review, things that may have come to mind when you were thinking about, well, how do I know if this is a good review or not? For example, has it been published in a top journal? Are there lots of well-known names on the author line, people you recognise as being leaders in the field? Have they included lots of studies? So is it a really big review? Have they used some really complex or some new methods, or maybe some very advanced statistics? You might think, has it been cited many times, or does it appear to have had a big impact in guidelines and so on? And perhaps it reaches really strong conclusions. So, it has a very definitive answer at the end of it. And all of these things may well be associated with a good review, but I would suggest they're not the most important thing, or they're not the only thing you should be looking for. So, for example, lots of included studies is great, but providing it was appropriate to include them all, and that the authors haven't sort of muddied the water by trying to combine studies that are too different to one another, and maybe they were overly inclusive. They were so keen to get lots of data in their review, they actually combine studies that really don't make sense to be put together. Similarly, complex methods or advanced statistics, they can be really powerful if used in the right way, but they can also be very misleading if they've not been appropriately used or interpreted. And I expect that's something that Kerry will tell us a bit more about later. And papers can be cited for many reasons and can have a big impact for many reasons, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were well conducted. And equally, decisive conclusions may be impressive and may make the review sort of hit the headlines and so on. But again, if the review was well conducted, quite a lot of good reviews end up concluding there isn't really enough evidence to be sure whether a treatment is effective or safe. And the most important conclusion is being specific about what further research is needed. And that can be a really important conclusion too. So just because a study doesn't, or a review doesn't come to a really strong conclusion that affects practice, doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't a good or a useful review. So I think they're sort of all things worth bearing in mind. Great. So I was just going to give a brief sort of outline of the key stages that most good systematic reviews will pass through. So first of all, it's important to ask if the review is a good use of resources. So is it addressing an important question that will help end users? And it can be really helpful to involve a wide range of people or stakeholders, as they're sometimes known, in the prioritisation process, to gain a broad perspective on what's important. And this could include researchers, but also healthcare professionals, policymakers, and perhaps most importantly, patients and carers. The next step would be defining a clear, answerable question, and this often involves using the PCOS framework, which I'm sure many of you will have come across. Just as a reminder, this stands for patient characteristics or population. So what age range of people are you talking about? What condition do they have? And what setting are they being treated in? Is it community? Is it secondary care? Is it somewhere else? The I usually stands for intervention. So what intervention or treatment are you interested in? And you probably will need to think about things like dose, duration, route, and frequency of the intervention. Whenever you're trying to work out if something is safe or effective, you need to compare it to something. And what you're comparing it to needs to be sort of nailed down. Is it standard care? Is it an alternative active intervention? Is it a placebo? So that's important to consider too when you're putting your review together. The O is outcome. So what are you hoping to change with this intervention, and how will it be measured? And in Cochrane reviews, we try to ensure that a range of patient important outcomes are included, rather than only biochemical or physiological indices, for example. So quality of life, adverse events, hospitalizations, deaths, these are often the sorts of outcomes that we're looking for in Cochrane reviews, rather than things that are more biochemical or physiological, as I said. And finally, sometimes an S is added to stand for study design. In an ideal world, we have evidence from randomized controlled trials for all interventions, but in reality, this isn't always possible or ethical. So we may need to think carefully about the types of studies that are likely to answer our question when we're setting out to do a review. So the next step is to search the literature, and that's using a search strategy which will have been designed based on the PICO that you've come up with. And at Cochrane, we're really lucky to have information specialists who help us with this step. It's very easy for this to go wrong, and finding the right evidence underpins the whole review. So if you haven't managed to do a good comprehensive search, it's unlikely your review will actually be presenting an unbiased picture of the evidence. The next step is choosing the studies from your search hits, and this is usually a two-stage screening process. Studies are initially assessed according to their title and their abstract, and then a short list is reassessed, but this time looking at the full text to make a final decision about whether it's in or out. We then extract the data that's of interest, including the important characteristics of the study and things like the numerical data, and then we assess the risk of bias of the studies using a validated tool, of which we have a few that Cochrane uses. The next step is then to combine the study findings. It may be possible to do a statistical synthesis, which is known as a meta-analysis in the context of a systematic review, but that's not always possible or appropriate. And there may be other ways of combining and presenting data in a digestible format that doesn't actually involve statistically combining the results. We then interpret the findings to help the reader understand the analyses, and then we assess the certainty of the combined findings, again using validated tools. And then finally, we formulate implications for practice and for research. And this is where having clinical experts involved is crucial, because they help to really set the review findings in a usable context for the people reading it. And then once the study has actually been published, or once the review's been published rather, then it's really important to get that evidence into the hands of the people who will most benefit from it. And this process is known as dissemination or knowledge translation. So they're the sort of steps that we go through to perform a systematic review. So what are the key quality markers that you might want to look for? You found a review that on the surface seems to be helpful for you. So maybe this otitis media in children, and the intervention being antibiotics. But are there any checks that you can sort of quickly do to help you decide if it's a good quality review and can be trusted? And I think this is something that will be again revisited later this afternoon in more detail. So this is just sort of an outline of some of the things that you might want to look for. But one key marker is checking that the authors wrote and pre-published a protocol for their work. There's a free online database hosted at York called Prospero, where you can register a protocol before you start work on the review itself. Some authors will also choose to publish their protocol in a journal, but that's not essential, as long as it's been registered somewhere where any changes that are made to that protocol can be very transparently seen. So a dated registration of the protocol that you can see was done before they started doing the review. And this prevents authors from being too data-led. We've all been there. It's really tempting that when you start doing a review to make changes based on what you're finding in the literature. You think, oh gosh, that's an interesting outcome. I didn't think of that. I'd like to get that into my review. But it's actually really important to stick to your predefined plan to minimise bias and to not end up sort of just following where the literature takes you, rather than sticking to what you decided was important a priori. Does the review have a well-defined question? This is really important too. Is it clear what they were asking, or is it a bit woolly and a bit open to interpretation? And then linked to this, were there really clear inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies, so that you can be sure that the studies they included were appropriate and the ones they excluded were also appropriately excluded. Then it's really important to check that they looked carefully for all the relevant studies. So was there a comprehensive search strategy designed? Did they search multiple databases? And did they maybe look for unpublished studies also, if relevant? Or did they apply sort of inappropriate or unjustified restrictions on their searches, such as only maybe going back 5 years or something? I mean, unless there was a good reason for doing that, then that would also potentially ring some alarm bells. How did they select the studies? So it's good practice, and in fact it's mandatory in Cochrane reviews for at least 2 people to independently select the studies, extract the data, and assess the risk of bias, and then resolve disagreements between themselves or by involving another author. So has the review got clear methods describing how that was done? So that's something that you should be looking out for. Have they then gone on to define the characteristics of the studies that they've included well? It's really important that you know things like the age range of the participants, the severity of the illness, the setting in which they were treated. That information will help you to apply the review findings to your population. And if it's not there, then it's really difficult to know whether you can use this review or not. So that's also a sort of a crucial quality marker that you're looking for. Has there been an appropriate data analysis and presentation of results? Now, this can be a bit difficult. I'm not a statistician myself, although I've got to know a little bit more about statistics since working with Cochrane. So it may be difficult always to tell whether what they've done has been appropriate. But certainly if there are complex methods used in the review, complex statistical methods, you would hope that there's some evidence that statistical peer review had happened, which will give you some reassurance that the methods they've used are right. And then are the conclusions based on the findings of the review, or do the authors sort of speculate or make unsubstantiated remarks or appear to even kind of overinterpret or over-egg what they've found? Always really tempting, especially when you've got a review which lots of, fairly inconclusive looking analyses. You always want to say something conclusive at the end of a review, but sometimes that's just not appropriate. So a good review will have, reined themselves in and only base their conclusions on the findings of the review rather than going further than that. And then finally, have there been minimal changes to the protocol? And if they have made changes, which does happen, occasionally something unanticipated will crop up during the review process, have they really clearly justified why they made that change and described it very clearly in the review? And Cochrane reviews, you'll find, will have a specific section called Differences Between Protocol and Review, where you can go and check how much of this happened. So that's a handy section to look for too. So you've found a review and you think it looks reasonable quality, it's meeting most or all of the quality markers, but is it actually of any use to me? Can I use this review? And a few things you also might want to think about is when it was published. So in a fast moving field, even 2 to 3 years might put a review a bit out of date. And in Cochrane, we have a sort of rolling process of looking at all our reviews that we've published over the last 5 to 10 years and deciding whether any of them need updating. So we do quite frequent scoping to see if new studies have been published which are likely to change the conclusions, and reviews where it looks like there is a sort of a body of new data emerging or new evidence. Then we'll try and update those reviews as soon as possible so that they continue to offer the best evidence to end users. Is it answering the question I have in mind? Is the PICO quite similar to the sort of PICO I created in my head when I came up with my sort of clinical question that I encountered in practice? I've already mentioned we're assuming it meets the quality markers, which is why we're looking at this review in the first place. But does the evidence actually apply to my population? So, for example, you might have been interested in looking at an intervention in children, and you find a systematic review which looked at the intervention in adults and children. So you think, okay, that's great. But when you actually look in more detail, perhaps they actually only found studies in adults. So you have to think quite carefully, even if it matches superficially what I'm thinking about, is the evidence in this review applicable to my population, which I want to treat with this evidence? So that's worth thinking about and will always be a bit of a judgment call. Are the findings presented in an accessible way, or am I struggling to make sense of them? Authors will often use helpful statistics like absolute risk differences and numbers needed to treat, and that can be really useful for having an informed discussion with a patient about the evidence that you've found. And then finally, are the conclusions useful? Are they sensible for end users? So I just wanted to spend a few minutes at the end of my talk giving a bit of sort of maybe an example of what might be seen as a good review. There's a sort of disclaimer attached to this. Obviously, I'm a bit biased as this was published by Cochrane Airways, which is the review group I work for, and I actually edited this review. So I know it quite well, and that's why I sort of picked it as an example. But obviously, I'm a little biased, so just a disclaimer there. So as I said, this was a review we did a few years ago, and it was looking at vitamin D for asthma. And we ran a workshop back in 2015 for patients and carers with asthma. The workshop was facilitated by a sort of few researchers and some people who work in the field. And what we really wanted to know was, what do the patients and the people who care for them really want to know about their asthma? What questions are sort of burning for them that they feel haven't really been answered? And we asked them to do quite a lot of ranking, and there was quite a lot of discussion and so on. And one question that emerged from this workshop was around vitamin D. So vitamin D is often of interest to the public. I think people see it as potentially quite a safe intervention, but something that has the potential to have an impact on quite a wide range of health outcomes. So we were keen to have a look at the evidence in asthma. So prioritisation involved this patient workshop, and then we did some scoping, which can also be part of prioritisation. And by scoping, we mean we ran a sort of very basic search of the literature, looking for evidence to see if it was going to be worth doing a systematic review. We don't expect to find every study when we do scoping, but we expect to get an idea of whether there's enough evidence out there to combine. And we found that there was. So there did appear to be a number of randomised control trials looking at vitamin D for asthma. So we decided to press on and do this review. So once we had made a decision to go ahead, the next step was to assemble an appropriate team. And we find that having a mix of methods and clinical specialists works the best for our reviews. And I know many groups find the same. And we were also fortunate enough to have a programme grant, again provided by the NIHR, to complete this review, which meant that we actually had some dedicated researcher time. And that's really handy. Not only does it really speed up the time taken to produce the review, but usually the dedicated researcher will be somebody quite experienced in review production and can make sure that the review is ticking all of those quality markers that we've already discussed. So using all of the right methods and so on. So once the author team had defined the question, so they'd taken this sort of slightly vague question about vitamin D for asthma and then turned it into the PICO that we discussed earlier, so defining the patient characteristics, exactly what the intervention is, what they're comparing it to, which outcomes they're interested in, and what studies they'd like to be looking for. We then got our information specialist, Liz Stovold, to run the search based on this PICO. And she searched a number of databases, including the Cochrane Airways Register of Trials. And furthermore, she's also funded by the NIHR. So we know that having her input just makes a huge difference to our reviews, because we know that the search has been conducted to a very high standard, and that if studies haven't been identified through it, then that it's much less likely that we've missed anything important. So the next stage would be selecting studies, extracting and analysing the data, and this was led by the methods specialists on the team, who provided training to the other members of the team. And we find this works really well, as it means that the extended team then get a bit more skills and confidence to take on to further future reviews if they write another review. And it also ensures that the analyses were sort of conducted appropriately and in accordance with Cochrane's methods, and gives you just that little bit more sort of quality assurance that the review's results are going to be reliable at the end. So interpreting the findings and formulating conclusions. So this is where the clinical experts particularly come into their own, as I've already mentioned. So they have a really detailed understanding of what these findings might mean in practice to patients and also to healthcare providers. And they can also identify quickly where the research gaps are. So that's why having the clinical experts there is so important the whole way through the review process, but particularly when it comes to setting the findings in context. Now, this review actually made quite an impact. It was fairly exciting when it got published. It seems the public are quite interested in vitamin D. So Cochrane approached the Science Media Centre, which is based at the Wellcome Centre in London. And the Science Media Centre held a press briefing the day before the review was published. And I attended as one of the panel members on the press briefing, which was definitely one of the scarier experiences of my life. So they'd invited a number of journalists to come along, and it was being recorded, and they were able to ask questions. And I was there with the lead author on the review and with one of the members of Central Cochrane. And it was just brilliant, actually, after looking back on it. But it was great to have the opportunity to actually give a bit more of a nuanced answer about the review, to really sort of get into a bit of detail about what we could and couldn't say based on the findings. So a scary experience, but ultimately a really good one. And then the following day, it was reported quite widely in a number of sort of media outlets, including the BBC. And the lead author was actually invited onto BBC Breakfast the following morning to give a brief interview about vitamin D for asthma. So that was great. It was really satisfying to see the work right through from the point of the patient saying it was important and they wanted to know the answer, right through until it sort of hitting the news and being out there for lots and lots of people to read. So just to say a little bit more about dissemination, actually, it was published, I think, in 2017, but it's already been cited over 200 times and appeared in 3 guidelines. And it has a pretty impressive altmetric score, which indicates that it was picked up quite widely in social media as well as via the news. And that's what that sort of colourful circle is there, is representing all the different sort of places where the review got reported. And perhaps most importantly, it led to further work by the author team, who went on to perform an individual patient data meta-analysis to tease out even more clearly the implications of this review. So individual patient data meta-analysis is where, instead of combining the aggregate results from individual primary studies, you combine the actual individual patient data from those individual studies. Now, this can be a really time-consuming process. Obviously, you need to get that data from the trialists. It needs to be anonymised so that you can use it. Often there needs to be a data sharing agreement, for example, so that can take a bit of time to set up. But once you've got that data, it can be really powerful for actually answering some of the, some of the more sort of nuanced questions about who this intervention works for and in what circumstances. So, what were the findings of this review that would cause such a stir? Well, it seems that vitamin D does have a clinically and statistically significant impact on severe asthma exacerbations. So the odds ratio of having a severe asthma exacerbation is 0.39 compared to if you were given placebo. So quite a sizable reduction, with confidence intervals from 0.19 to 0.78, suggesting that this result was unlikely to have come about by chance. And it gives a number needed to treat of 27. So you would need to treat 27 people with asthma with vitamin D to prevent one person from having a severe exacerbation over the follow-up period. And given what we know about asthma treatments, not all of them are completely benign, and we know that there are side effects with a number of different asthma treatments. I think vitamin D is often seen as something potentially quite safe if taken in appropriate doses. So a number needed to treat of 27 doesn't really seem too bad. And furthermore, the review seemed to suggest that there wasn't a likely increase in serious adverse events, so it didn't seem that vitamin D was harming people, although it should be noted that this estimate's imprecise. So while the odds ratio is almost exactly 1, suggesting no difference between the placebo and the vitamin D group, and the confidence intervals do range from 0.54 to 1.89. So we haven't excluded the possibility of either an increase or reduction in adverse events with vitamin D, but it doesn't look particularly likely from the evidence we found. Just going back to whether the results are sort of applicable to all people, which is something you need to think about when you are looking at any review. Of note, children were underrepresented in the meta-analysis, as were people with more severe asthma, which is often the case, unfortunately, in research. So if you're thinking about applying this to children in practice or to a more severe person with more severe background asthma in practice, then you would probably need to think a bit more carefully. And then crucially, it was also not clear if it applied only to people or mostly to people with lower baseline vitamin D status. And that's where this individual patient data meta-analysis would be so useful to do. And I've talked a lot about quality, so assessing quality and how important that is. So how did the review authors assess the quality of the data? Can we believe the review's results? Were they based on good quality studies? So they used the Cochrane risk of bias tool to assess the risk of bias in the individual studies that generated that spotty diagram you can see here with all the blobs. So the green spots mean low risk of bias, the yellow mean unclear, and the red mean high risk of bias. And you can see overall, they were mostly high quality studies generating these sort of green dots, which suggests that the evidence they were producing is reasonably reliable and likely to be sort of fairly free from bias. And then to assess the evidence or the certainty of the pooled evidence, they used a tool called GRADE, which is a well-established tool often used by guideline producers as well, and I'm sure, again, many of you will have come across it. But it looks at a number of domains to give a certainty rating to the pooled results, and that certainty is either high, moderate, low, or very low. And this helps us to understand how confident we can be whether these the review findings are actually likely to represent the true effect of the intervention in the population, or is it quite likely that if we did more research or better research, we would actually find quite a different answer. And you can see their first outcome rated here was high quality, so we were pretty confident in the findings of this review. So what's the bottom line? Well, I would say, just to briefly summarize what we've covered, that it's really important that a good review will have a readily accessible pre-published protocol, which hopefully the authors followed. And if they didn't follow, there's good justification for why they didn't. You want to see really clearly reported methods, and that will help you to make your quality assessment of the review. So did they describe how studies were selected, how their search was performed, how they resolved disagreements, all of those sorts of things that I've mentioned. Have they done a quality assessment of the included studies? You've got to remember that a collection of poor quality studies won't result in high certainty evidence. A review could be conducted following the very best practice, But if the underlying studies are biased and unreliable, then a good review will notice this and will conclude that the evidence is low certainty and inconclusive. A not so good review might be tempted to just combine all the results, not really look at the quality of the underlying studies, and come out with quite a misleading conclusion. So a review can't magically make poor studies better, if you see what I mean. And although having eminent authors and being published in top journal and having lots of citations are all good things and are frequently associated with good quality reviews, I think it's really important to keep these quality markers in mind when you're reading any review, and I don't think you can go too far wrong. So that's the sort of overview I wanted to give you of what in my mind makes a good systematic review, and I'm really happy to take any questions at this point if anyone has any. And there was also a reference on one of the previous slides I gave to a Breathe article written by a couple of colleagues of mine about making sense of Cochrane reviews. It's quite a short article, and it goes through quite a lot of the things I've mentioned in this talk. So if you were interested in that, then I'm sure the slides could be shared so that you would be able to have a look at that reference if you want to sort of look a bit further into it. So thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be really happy to take them now.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. It was a very interesting talk, and I think I gave you quite a challenging topic for half an hour. So we've got a couple of questions that have come up on the Q&A. So the first one is from Mohammed, wondering about the difference in clinical and statistical significance.
That's a really good question. So statistical significance, as you know, is usually defined by having a p-value of less than 0.05 or having confidence intervals that don't cross the line of no effect. So when we're talking about a dichotomous outcome, that will be confidence intervals that don't include 1, or if we're talking about a mean difference, it will be confidence intervals that don't include 0. So you're confident to at least a reasonable degree that these results didn't come about by chance. So that's statistical significance. But clinical significance is when you say not only are these reviews results statistically significant, they're actually meaningful to patients. So you can imagine an example, for example, a huge review perhaps looking at a blood pressure lowering medication, and they may have got thousands of participants, and they've discovered that a particular drug lowers blood pressure by 1 or 2 millimeters of mercury to a high degree of statistical significance, but actually that difference is really too small to have any clinical benefit to the patient. So in that case, we would say it has statistical significance, but not clinical significance. So it can be a bit of a judgment call as to whether you think the difference you've identified is actually important to patients or not. And helpfully, for many of the most commonly used scales, I know most about respiratory scales, obviously, because I work with Cochrane Airways, but there'll often be a minimum clinically important difference defined. So one of the scales we use quite a lot in respiratory research is the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire. And it's a scale that goes from 0 to 100, and it's a quality of life questionnaire. And the MCID, or the minimal clinically important difference for this scale, has been identified to be about 4. So that's when you'd expect a patient to actually feel better if they've had a difference of more than 4 in there, or feel worse, in fact, if it's gone up by 4. So that can be really helpful in working out whether something's clinically important and not only statistically important to patients. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. And I think the other thing that I found having a look at systematic reviews is that sometimes the kind of what the authors perceive to be the minimally important difference is kind of predefined as part of the protocol as well, which is always quite helpful to see. That's great. And we've got a few other questions coming through. Just a reminder, if people could put their questions into the Q&A box, which gives us the option to upvote rather than the chat, which sometimes isn't seen by everyone. So next question is about kind of validated tools for assessing risk of bias. Is the Cochrane risk of bias tool the best one to use, or is there alternative ones?
Gosh, that's a really good question. So the Cochrane risk of bias tool, I think, is very widely used, both within, mandatory within Cochrane, and I think it's used outside Cochrane quite widely too. In the last year or two, Cochrane's actually developed a new risk of bias tool for assessing randomized controlled trials, risk of bias version 2, which is rather more involved, but actually does give a much more useful answer, actually, I think. We're still sort of exploring how to use it in our group. It is quite complicated, but I think it's definitely an improvement. There are a number of other tools though, and the Cochrane risk of bias tools there for randomized control trials, but there are many other tools which are also used for other types of study, so for qualitative studies, for observational studies, and so on. I think the key thing is looking to see if it's been validated. Has there been information published about this tool, which suggests it's been used by a number of people who have validated its findings. I mean, within Cochrane, we would always recommend the Cochrane preferred tools, which are the risk of bias 1 and 2, and then for non-randomized studies, we use one called Robbins, or the risk of bias for interventions in non-randomized studies, and so they're the two that we probably use most often. But there are a number out there, and you will see a range being used in different reviews. But I think providing there's a solid reference for it, it appears to be something that's being used quite widely and has been validated, then I would say it's quite reasonable for review authors to use other tools.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And then another question is, should the grade assessment be done by a certain amount of people, and should they be different from the researchers, so the authors of the systematic review?
Oh, now that is a really good question. Now within Cochrane reviews, yes, they're done in duplicate, so they're done by 2 different people independently who will look at the same information and then make their own grade assessment according to the 5 grade domains of imprecision, uncertainty, risk and publication bias, inconsistency, and overall risk of bias of the studies, and then we'll have come up with their own sort of grade assessment, and then you look at your 2 side by side and you thrash out why you said one thing and why the person said another, and so on, and then if you haven't managed to come to a conclusion, you can involve another member of your author team, or even an external methodologist to try and help you to come to an agreement. We always use the review authors actually to do that process. We don't usually involve external authors. But it may well be that other guideline bodies and so on do use different researchers for that part of the process. That's not something I'm familiar with. We've always done that internally. Maybe that's something that Kerry might possibly know more about. She may touch on that, but no, certainly within our reviews, it's done by the same author team.
Yeah, it's something I think it's quite an interesting idea, because you sometimes wonder if, when people are drawing conclusions, you're thinking, actually, are these results being over-egged?
Yeah.
If you've got someone very external coming in who isn't caught up within the review, the amount of effort that's gone in before it, will they draw different conclusions? So it's
the other thing with Cochrane reviews is they do pass through quite a rigorous editorial process as well. So we always, as editors, I do some authoring, but mostly editing these days. And the summary of findings table, where the grade judgments are presented, is always something we scrutinise very carefully. And we'll quite often go back to the authors and say, are you sure about this judgment? Do you want to have another discussion? We felt that perhaps you've been a bit harsh, or you've been a bit generous, and they'll maybe then go and have another look at it and sort of think about it again. So there is a little bit more scrutiny than perhaps there would be in a typical journal, perhaps. Yeah.
Great. And then we've got a kind of question from Catherine, saying that she's noticed that the issue of, was this systematic review needed, in social media, coming up in social media recently, and the issue of updating reviews. Kind of any thoughts or comments about the issues of, I suppose, reviews becoming out of date, obsolete?
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem. I mean, it's there was a time when Cochrane was trying to update all its reviews every 2 years, which has completely fallen by the wayside. Very difficult to do that. We have just in our group in Cochrane Airways, we have a sort of a portfolio of about 350 reviews, and updating all of those every 2 years, well, A, wouldn't really be desirable, if we're honest, and B, would be completely impossible. So we apply a sort of prioritization process to our updates as well as our new reviews. So we're quite often sort of scanning the literature, looking for whether there's likely to be evidence out there that's going to change the conclusions of a review. And if we think the evidence is important and likely to change conclusions, then we will try and update that review as promptly as possible. But it often depends on capacity, and authors may have moved on to doing something else in the meantime, understandably, and may not have time or the inclination to update their review. So then sometimes we're looking for a new author team. And also Cochrane methods sort of evolve. So quite often we decide that actually a new review is what we're looking for, with the most up-to-date methods in the protocol. So sometimes it means starting again. I think the other part of the question was the review needed? I think that's actually a really good question. And And I think sometimes systematic reviews, you know, there's a temptation to do them, but actually maybe that question's already been answered. We have a review looking at pulmonary rehabilitation for COPD, and it reaches such firm conclusions with such consistency that we've actually closed the review. We've said no more reviews on basically basic pulmonary rehabilitation for COPD. It should now be the standard of care. What we're looking at now is, are there other ways you can deliver it? Can it be delivered remotely? Can it be delivered with minimal equipment? You know, various other sort of permutations of the question. But I would say now, if somebody went to do a systematic review looking purely at pulmonary rehab for COPD, I would say that's probably a bit of a waste of time. I think we know the answer to that question. What we need to know is how to make it more accessible, how to get people engaged in it, you know, all those sorts of things. So I think the question about research redundancy is a really, really important one, and one that we should all engage with as researchers, you know, particularly when we're using scarce resources. So yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. You happy for a few more?
Yeah, absolutely, if we've got time.
So we've got a question from Patrick saying that he's interested in how comparisons are selected. So some are stated in the Cochrane protocol, but there's an element of waiting to see what you get back from the data extraction and then seeing what you can kind of, you know, feasibly pull together.
Yeah.
And then identifying interventions that are not identical but are similar to combine and compare against other interventions. I suppose it's about those kind of grey areas where you may need to be changing your kind of protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely try, when we're putting protocols together, to try and imagine what would be sensible comparisons to make. So you don't necessarily want to compare your active intervention to, you know, alternative interventions and placebo and standard best practice. You know, all together, that's going to give you a very muddy and difficult to interpret answer. So you're absolutely right. We try and select the basic comparisons that we think are likely to come up a priori, and to define those. But you're absolutely right. And I've been involved in many reviews where you find unanticipated comparisons halfway through the review process. And it's sometimes very difficult to know what to do. And the protocol is not meant to be restricting you from doing something sensible. So if you find something unanticipated and actually you think, no, this is sensible, we just didn't really know that we were going to find this, then it is okay to make that change to your protocol, as long as it's really clearly detailed why you did it. And ideally, it should be done long before you've actually seen the results of any systematic review, or a meta-analysis rather. So what you don't want to do is start just combining results in lots of different ways and thinking, oh, this one gives a statistically significant answer. This is what I'm going to stick with. It's much better to have said, okay, I didn't anticipate these comparisons coming up. I will put them in, but I'm going to make this decision before I've actually combined any data. And then that's a bit less risk of sort of the data-led decision making. So yes, as much as possible, we try to predefine them, but we do allow ourselves to make sensible changes as we go through the review process. Otherwise, you're not producing the most useful product for end users, and that just doesn't make sense to deliberately restrict yourself in that way. So that's a really good question, and something we encounter a lot.
So it sounds like it's like during the screening phases, or maybe when you're probably before data extraction, that you're starting to maybe see these kind of patterns come up, and actually lots of people seem to be using this outcome to hadn't thought of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's fine. And then we've got another question showing it, you know, caveated by it depends on the topic, but as a general rule of thumb, how much literature must be minimally included for a good systematic review. So I think that's probably around how much do you need to start combining into meta-analysis. And secondly, can we include previous systematic reviews done years ago with other types of primary research?
Right, so both really good questions. I mean, we don't actually have a minimum amount of data for putting in a systematic review, and we do occasionally publish what we call empty reviews. So reviews where we think it's a really important question, and we've searched the literature and we've found that there are no randomized controlled trials meeting our inclusion criteria. And then the focus of the review then becomes making really specific research recommendations to try and sort of galvanize or to prompt that sort of primary research to be carried out. I think when it comes to talking about whether it's worth doing a statistical synthesis, that will depend a lot on the topic area. Usually we would say, I mean, you know, different authors will set a slightly different threshold. But sometimes people say if it's less than 3 studies, it's not, it's not worth combining statistically. Other people will present single studies on a forest plot just to, just for kind of the visual impact. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about that. And again, it will depend a little bit on what you said in your protocol, what you set out to do. And then there was a second part to the question, wasn't there?
Yeah, so it's about including kind of previously published systematic reviews and kind of, that involves primary research.
So we wouldn't include the review itself as an included study, if you see what I mean. So if we found an old systematic review that was asking the same question when we did our search, but we would definitely look at their list of included studies to see which of those studies could be included as primary studies in our systematic review, and then we would re-extract the data from them and so on. So it would be quite rare for us to use. In fact, I don't think we've probably ever really used the data from another systematic review straight into one of our reviews. We go back to the primary study and re-extract it. We will have probably chosen some slightly different outcomes. We might want to analyze the data in a slightly different way. So we go back to the original underlying research papers. But other systematic reviews can be really helpful for making sure that you did find all of the relevant studies. So
yeah, I think it's that part of that citation checking, isn't it, that you can kind of make sure that your search has picked up all of everything that's relevant. Fine. And then probably just following on from that very briefly is what type of statistical methods should a reliable review be using?
Ooh, that may be a question more for Kerry, who I think is coming up next. No, I mean, what I think the answer really is that the method or the statistical method should be chosen sort of appropriate for what sort of data you're dealing with. For example, we do mostly straightforward pairwise meta-analysis. So we compare intervention A versus intervention B, or intervention A versus placebo, and present those on forest plots. That's the most common analysis we do. But I think Kerry will be talking about some of the other statistical methods which may be appropriate depending on what you've got. And one of those is something called network meta-analysis, where you can compare a number of different treatment options, often also versus placebo, to get a sort of a ranking of treatments. So that's often most appropriate if you've got a condition, for example, where there's a number of interventions which might all be appropriate, but you're having difficulty deciding which one is actually the most effective and the most safe in a particular population. And then a network meta-analysis might help you to come to that answer, because it's not just comparing A versus B, and it allows you to draw some indirect sort of comparisons between interventions. So I think the method very much depends on what the data is, and it's a bit difficult to say that one method is always reliable. It's very much dependent on what you've got. So and again, should all be defined hopefully in the protocol.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we'll call time on this question and answers. Thank you very much for your time, Rebecca. And
not at all, it's been a pleasure.